Senior diplomat Arvis stood at the center of the Galactic Council's recording chamber, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted the heavy folds of his ceremonial robes. The chamber, once a shining symbol of interstellar unity, now seemed to drown in an atmosphere thick with regret and fear. High above, the ceremonial crystals that lined the ceiling flickered, their usual vibrant glow reduced to erratic pulses of dim light. The polished obsidian floors reflected the scattered glimmers, creating ripples of fractured luminescence. Arvis took a deep breath, feeling the weight of countless eyes and expectations pressing down on him. He closed his eyes for a moment, grounding himself before beginning. His voice, usually strong and unwavering, carried a somber, almost mournful tone. My fellow council members, I stand here not to offer excuses, but to give testimony, a record of our shared history, a recounting of our failures. He paused, the echo of his words hanging in the air. His gaze swept the assembly, meeting eyes that held worry, defiance, and above all, fear. He could not blame them. They had reason to fear. His mind drifted back to the early days of the Galactic Council, a time brimming with optimism. Humanity had been a curiosity then, a species barely taking its first steps among the stars. The Council, made up of ancient races that had long mastered the cosmos, regarded them as little more than children. They were called amusing pets, a term thrown around with casual condescension. Arvis remembered how the Eldari ambassadors, proud beings of crystalline intellect, would laugh in their musical voices when discussing humanity's primitive space technology. Others would smile indulgently, amused by the humans' earnest efforts to adapt to galactic diplomacy. What struck him most, even now, was how humanity had tolerated this disdain. They did not lash out or argue. Instead, they listened, learned, and adapted, with a patience that Arvis had once mistaken for meekness. It was uncanny, almost unsettling, the way they absorbed insult after insult, waiting. At the time, it had seemed like harmless fun to belittle them, but now he understood. Their restraint was not born of weakness, but of quiet, deliberate strength. A sudden tremor rocked the chamber, and Arvis stumbled. Crystals overhead flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the walls. His voice caught in his throat, and he gripped the edge of the podium. For a brief, harrowing moment, silence reigned. The entire council froze, ears straining for the sound of another impact. When none came, Arvis steadied himself, though his heart still pounded. He swallowed and forced himself to continue. We believed ourselves untouchable, he said, his voice quieter, but no less intense. We misjudged them. Humanity's patience was not the cowardly submission we assumed it to be. No, it was something far more dangerous. We were blind to the warnings. He began recounting the events that had led them to this precipice. They showed restraint when we dismissed their mining claims over the richest asteroid fields, Arvis said, his voice gaining strength. When their ambassador, Eliza Garcia, protested at this very podium, she was met with laughter. The council turned a deaf ear to her measured words, and she returned to her seat, her face an unreadable mask. We thought it a victory, another triumph over the so-called naive humans. But in hindsight, I realized we were playing with a fire we did not understand. Arvis clenched his jaw, recalling the sense of smug satisfaction that had permeated the chamber that day. The humans had left quietly, without further protest, and the council had congratulated itself on keeping power firmly in its grasp. He exhaled, his breath unsteady. Their patience then should have served as a warning, but we ignored it. His gaze drifted across the assembly, reading the anxious expressions on each face. Then came the restrictions on trade routes, he continued. We choked off their commerce, enforced tariffs that strangled their growing economy. Ambassador Garcia returned, her voice calm, her words laced with warnings of unintended consequences. We laughed in her face, mocked her thinly veiled threats, confident that humanity had no bite behind its bark. Arvis shook his head, the weight of realization pressing down on him. How blind we were. Another, more violent tremor reverberated through the chamber, and gasps erupted from the council members. Arvis paused again, his composure slipping, before he forced himself onward. The third and final incident should have shattered our illusions, he said, his voice growing raw. When we denied them terraforming rights for their overcrowded colonies and gifted entire planets to the wealthy Trixari elite for luxury resorts, Garcia's patience was visibly strained. Her smile had a razor's edge, her voice a tremor of barely suppressed rage. She spoke of documentation, of recording every slight and injustice, but we did not listen. We assumed she was posturing, that humanity was powerless to act. Arvis felt the heavy silence in the room, the tension now a living thing. He knew what lay ahead, knew the horror he would soon have to recount. He tightened his grip on the podium, his heart heavy with regret. We dismissed their warnings. We underestimated their resolve. And now, we stand on the brink, haunted by the consequences of our arrogance. The tremor subsided, but the fear remained. Arvis looked into the eyes of his fellow council members, seeing for the first time the fragility of the order they had built. Humanity's patience had finally run out, and they had only themselves to blame. Arvis's words hung heavily in the air, and the chamber seemed to draw in a collective, uneasy breath. The past weighed on them all, but there was no denying the sequence of events that had led them here. It began with the first incident, one that Arvis had once considered a mere footnote in the annals of interstellar politics. The dispute over mining rights had seemed inconsequential at the time. Humanity's colonies had staked claims on several asteroid fields rich with the rare minerals necessary for advanced technology. The Council, however, had ruled against them on a series of obscure technicalities. The decision enriched a rival alien faction, the proud and powerful Varnak Syndicate, who had long-standing ties with several influential council members. It had seemed so trivial, so distant, a matter of routine politics. Arvis had sat through those hearings, listening to the humans' arguments, with a mixture of boredom and contempt, barely noticing the diplomatic tension simmering just below the surface. Ambassador Eliza Garcia had stood before the council's podium, her voice steady, her eyes betraying no hint of the frustration she must have felt. "We have followed the procedures set by this council," she had declared. "We hope for fairness, for an outcome that reflects the spirit of interstellar cooperation." Her appeal had been polite, meticulously composed, delivered in the careful tones of a diplomat who knew better than to show her true emotions. Yet when the ruling came down in favor of the Varnaks, the chamber had erupted into smug satisfaction. The council had dismissed humanity's reaction as impotent frustration, noting with amusement how Garcia's delegation had quietly collected their documents and left without further protest. The indifference of the council had felt, at the time, like a sign of their superiority. It was only later that Arvis understood just how dangerous it had been to ignore the measured silence of a wounded species. Arvis recalled, now with a pang of guilt, the laughter that had rippled through the chamber. "They won't make trouble," one counselor had remarked. "They know their place." At the time, Arvis had nodded in agreement, never realizing that humanity was not conceding, but remembering. Even now he could see Garcia's composed expression in his mind, her calm not born of submission, but of an iron-willed patience that had gone unnoticed. It was a patience that masked something deeper, something far more formidable than the council had ever suspected. The second incident followed swiftly. Humanity's growing interstellar trade network had begun to prosper, their economic influence spreading to once-ignored sectors of space. The Council, however, found a way to cut them down to size. Key trade routes were suddenly reclassified as restricted military zones. Overnight, human commerce was choked, the flow of goods disrupted, and exorbitant fees imposed on every ship that dared traverse these newly restricted lanes. The impact on humanity's fledgling interstellar economy had been catastrophic. Again, Ambassador Garcia had stood before them, her demeanor calm but her words edged with warning. "Such restrictions have consequences," she had stated, her tone even. "We ask that the Council reconsider, for the sake of interstellar harmony." Arvis remembered the way her words had been met. Council members had mocked her, interpreting her diplomacy as desperation. There had been laughter, jeering at her attempts to negotiate. Even Arvis had joined in the collective derision, failing to see the glint of steel behind Garcia's eyes. "Empty threats," someone had sneered. "What can humanity do but bend to our will?" They had not realized that Garcia's warning was not a bluff, but a final appeal to reason. It was not a threat, but a declaration, and they had been too blind to understand. Arvis had watched as the human delegation departed, and even then he had not imagined the fire that smoldered beneath their outward calm. The third incident came not long after, and by then humanity's patience had begun to fray. Overcrowded human colonies, struggling to sustain themselves, had petitioned for terraforming rights on nearby planets. Their requests were dismissed without serious consideration or even a pretense of fairness. Instead, the Council had approved luxury resorts for the Trixari, an affluent alien species known for their extravagant lifestyles. It had been a slap in the face to humanity, a declaration that their needs did not matter, that the suffering of their people was secondary to the whims of alien elites. Arvis remembered that session with painful clarity. Garcia had spoken once more, her voice no longer entirely calm, her smile tight and strained. "Your decisions have been noted," she had said, her words carrying an undercurrent of tension. "We are documenting every outcome, every action, every injustice. The record will speak for itself." Arvis had dismissed her statement then, even smirking, as he exchanged glances with his fellow council members. They had assumed humanity's record-keeping was little more than bureaucratic formality, failing to grasp that it was the foundation of a case they would one day present with devastating clarity. The council had believed themselves secure, untouchable in their authority. But humanity's patience was not a sign of weakness. It was a warning, one they had ignored at their peril. Arvis now realized how wrong they had been, how deeply they had underestimated the resolve of a species whose patience was never meant to be mistaken for weakness. The moments they had laughed away were now returning to haunt them. Humanity had not forgotten, and every slight was building toward a reckoning that they, in their arrogance, had failed to foresee. The council chambers had always been a place of power, of laws and negotiations, but now they felt like a tomb, haunted by the ghosts of decisions made in ignorance. The shadows that had once seemed inconsequential now loomed large, and Arvis could feel the weight of impending judgment pressing down on him. Humanity's patience had run out, and the galaxy would soon understand what that truly meant. Arvis's recollection of the third incident trailed into silence, and the weight of what came next seemed almost too much to bear. He could feel the gathered council members holding their breath, waiting for the moment they all dreaded. It was the moment that had changed everything, the breaking point from which there had been no return, the tragedy of the stellar hope. Arvis closed his eyes briefly, the memory crashing over him like a wave. The human research vessel had been a marvel of science and cooperation, a symbol of what humanity could achieve when given the freedom to explore the cosmos. On board were not only scientists but their families, children who had been eager to see the wonders of the galaxy. It had been a voyage of dreams, a mission to study cosmic phenomena and share their findings with all the races of the Galactic Council. And yet, that symbol of hope and collaboration had been reduced to twisted wreckage. The Moxarian patrol ships had intercepted the vessel, an act Arvis had first dismissed as an unfortunate but explainable misunderstanding. But the truth had been far darker. The Moxarian captains had fired without warning, disregarding the civilian status of the ship and the desperate pleas from the crew. The haunting transmission from the Stellar Hope's captain had been burned into Arvis's memory, a ghost that refused to be exorcised. He remembered her voice, steady yet tinged with terror. "This is Captain Reva Albright of the Stellar Hope. We are a research vessel, unarmed, carrying civilians and children. I repeat, there are children on board. We are no threat." There had been a pause, a moment of silence so absolute that it felt as though the entire galaxy was holding its breath. Then came the captain's final words, a broken whisper that had echoed across the stars. "Please, for the love of all that's holy, think of the children." The transmission ended with a burst of static, and then nothing. The Moxarian ships fired, obliterating the Stellar Hope and all its innocent souls. Arvis's voice cracked as he spoke of it, and he could see some council members flinch, as if trying to push the horror away. But there was no escaping the truth. The destruction of the Stellar Hope had been a crime that no words, no reparations could ever erase. Humanity's response had been swift, and it had shattered the illusion of peace the Council had maintained. The chamber itself had been violated in a way that no one could have imagined. Arvis vividly remembered the moment Commander James Carter stormed into the Council chamber, not through the grand, imposing doors, but by blasting through one of the side walls. Dust and debris had rained down, the ceremonial crystal shattering into a kaleidoscope of broken light. Council members had screamed, cowering behind their podiums, as Carter stepped through the smoke and ruin. The man had been a force of nature, his military uniform scorched and torn, his eyes ablaze with fury. Arvis had never before felt such primal fear. Carter had carried a weapon, though he did not need it to make his intentions clear. "Play the footage," he had commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed through the fractured chamber. "Play the footage of the attack." No one had dared to refuse. Trembling hands activated the holo display, and the Council watched the attack on the Stellar Hope once more. They listened to the captain's plea, the innocence of her voice, and the chilling silence that followed. Arvis had seen the raw, unfiltered rage in Carter's eyes, a fury that seemed barely contained. The Council had finally understood, in that terrible moment, that they had provoked a power they could not hope to control. Standing beside Carter was Ambassador Eliza Garcia. Gone was the composed diplomat who had delivered speeches with calm precision. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with grief and rage. The veneer of diplomacy had shattered, leaving behind a woman who had lost too much, whose patience had finally been exhausted. Her voice, when she spoke, carried none of the warmth or reason that had once defined her. "No more," she declared, the words cutting through the chaos like a blade. "We will not tolerate this. Not one more loss, not one more insult." The Council, in their desperation, had scrambled to offer reparations. Apologies, promises, and empty assurances spilled from their lips, but it was too late. The line had been crossed, the trust irreparably broken. Carter and Garcia had laid out humanity's grievances one by one, with a cold and unrelenting precision. They spoke of the mining disputes, the trade route restrictions, the denied terraforming rights, each injustice stacking higher until the room felt suffocating under the weight of their collective failure. Arvis had listened, his heart heavy, knowing there was nothing he could say to undo the damage. Humanity's demands were not for money or influence. They demanded accountability, respect, and above all, justice. The arrogance of the Council had led them here, to this inevitable reckoning, and there was no turning back. The galaxy had underestimated humanity for far too long, and now the consequences of that misjudgment were clear. Arvis's voice grew heavier as he recounted the breaking point, the destruction of the Stellar Hope. The chamber had become a place haunted by grief and shattered illusions, yet the story did not end there. Humanity's response had been far more calculated and far more devastating than anyone could have anticipated. Arvis detailed the moment when humanity revealed its true strength. It had begun subtly, almost imperceptibly. The human ships, long mocked for their outdated technology and unremarkable design, had hovered in the void of space, seemingly vulnerable. But in a display that would be forever etched into galactic history, those same ships shed their cloaking facades. The outdated exteriors disintegrated, revealing sleek warships armed with weapons the Council had never even imagined. The transformation had been so complete, so stunning, that Arvis himself had been left breathless. Humanity had hidden its true capabilities, biding its time, waiting for the day when diplomacy would no longer suffice. Fleet Admiral Mira Patel, a commanding presence with piercing eyes and a voice that brokered no argument, addressed the Council from the bridge of her flagship. The holo display had brought her image into the chamber, magnified and unyielding. "We have always sought peace," she declared, her words as unrelenting as the warships now hovering over Council worlds. "We hoped that dialogue and patience would be enough, but you have left us no choice." Arvis could still hear the echoes of the Council's stunned silence. For centuries, the Council had regarded humanity as a minor player, a species of little consequence. Now, faced with the full might of humanity's hidden power, that arrogance crumbled. The weapons revealed by humanity defied the laws of warfare as they knew them. Gravity manipulation fields that could crush entire fleets in an instant. Quantum field disruptors that rendered shields and defensive technologies useless. And the most fearsome of all, matter disintegration beams that could reduce even the strongest alloy to dust in seconds. Arvis described the horror that swept through the Council as they watched their prideful fleet, ships that had once been the galaxy's ultimate symbol of power, fall apart under humanity's assault. It wasn't even a battle. It was a demonstration. Humanity had no need for prolonged combat. The galaxy's most advanced fleets were decimated with a precision and ease that left no room for doubt. The realization was as stark as it was humbling. The Council's strategic patience had been nothing more than folly, a dangerous game played with a species that had perfected the art of waiting. The aftermath had been swift and transformative. Arvis's testimony turned toward the restructuring that followed. Humanity did not demand conquest or subjugation, as some had feared. Instead, their demands were simple but absolute: transparency, justice, and the protection of the innocent. No more secret deals, no more underhanded decisions that favored the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. The Council had little choice but to accept these terms. Arvis himself had overseen the adoption of new protocols, including the establishment of what would be called the Stellar Hope Test, a safeguard designed to ensure that the tragedy of the human research vessel would never be repeated. The Council chambers had changed too. The ceremonial crystals, once symbols of unchecked authority, now shone with a more subdued light, a reminder of the humility they had been forced to learn. Arvis concluded his testimony, his voice wavering as he acknowledged the deeper truth. Humanity's patience had never been infinite, but it had been rooted in a strength the galaxy had failed to understand, a strength that was both strategic and deeply human. As Arvis finished, the chamber was enveloped in silence. The human fleet still held its position above the Council worlds, a silent reminder of the power that had lain hidden for so long. Yet, there was a sense of hope, too. Humanity, despite the wrongs inflicted upon them, sought not domination, but a fairer future for all species. Arvis took a breath, his heart heavy yet resolute. "They do not seek vengeance," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "They seek justice. They seek a galaxy where patience is a virtue, not a weapon to be exploited. But mark my words, never again should their patience be mistaken for weakness." The room remained still, the weight of those words settling in. The galaxy had been forever changed, and the lesson learned was one that they could not afford to forget.